Yes, Mr. Hill.
So we are turning to the issue of domestic production of blood products and questions around self-sufficiency. And there will be a series of presentations in the coming weeks and then some oral witnesses as well. We are beginning with a presentation on production of blood products in England and Wales. We will follow that with some individual presentations on Dr. Lane and Dr. Smith, two significant figures from BPL, which will be done by Ms. Richards towards the end of this week. Next week, Mr. Buchra will present a chronological account of blood product production in Scotland. We will also look at pool sizes that week, and then we will have the witnesses following up, who are Dr. Snape, Dr. Perry, and Dr. Foster.
And will we be examining although we're separating England and Wales from Scotland, and Northern Ireland is going to come in there, I think, next week, isn't
Yes.
it? We are going to bear in mind, are we, that there may have been sources of production if one viewed the whole as a United Kingdom.
Yes, that is something that will be touched upon today and examined in more detail next week by Mr. Buchra. Northern Ireland will be dealt with more with Scotland, because that is where product began to be made in the 1980s for Northern Ireland. Again, it will be touched upon today and some evidence as to why that arrangement came to be.
So will we, in the course of the presentations, be looking at, or in the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks, be looking at the question of whether Scotland could have supplied more in respect of the UK's consumption than it did?
Yes, we will be looking at that. We, in preparing these presentations, we are very conscious of the fact that you have heard oral evidence. These presentations aren't an effort to try to surpass that oral evidence or even to try to analyse it. They are a piece of a jigsaw to go with the oral evidence rather than replacing it.
Well, those who read the opening words of the presentation will be left in no doubt this is not the view of the inquiry. These are relevant documents, and to assist understanding, you put them in chronological order and made observations about them, but they are as good as the person who's making the observations.
Exactly so, sir. These are not our submissions. These are an account of what the documents seem to us to show.
And you will be open to others who look at the documents to interpret them in a different way if they think that is appropriate, and to persuade me in their submissions that that's the way I should look at them.
Absolutely, sir. That two people can look in good faith at the same document and come to different conclusions, and that will be an opportunity for all core participants to make those submissions in due course.
Yes.
This presentation that I'm going to start today, and I'm sure we'll go into tomorrow as well, doesn't attempt to be comprehensive. It is inevitably based upon a selection of the documents. Otherwise, we would be here for many, many weeks. No special status is gained by a document being included or excluded, and as you've just been saying, so the core participants may well feel that there are other documents which are equally or more important, and they will have an opportunity to bring those to your attention in due course. All conclusions, sir, are for you, and your council team do not seek to trespass on that territory at all. The core participants will also be aware that a report has been provided from the expert fractionators instructed by the inquiry. It is also on the inquiry's website. We are not currently proposing to call the authors of a fractionation report to give oral evidence, and we're not seeking to explore that report in the next 3 weeks. It's there as background. It will have the same status as any other piece of evidence, expert or otherwise, and you can accept or reject it in part or in whole and give such weight to it as you feel is appropriate. If core participants have any particular observations on the report, then they can be provided as part of their written closing submissions, which the inquiry has asked to be filed in late October. So I mention that so that everybody is aware that it is there, but it is not a resource that I will be referring to in the next few days.
Well, it doesn't deal directly with issues of self-sufficiency, though it does, I think, suggest that the first commercial anti-hemophilic fraction was produced in Sweden and marketed as AHF Krabby or IO Krabby.
Yes, so
and that was in 1956.
I think that's right, sir, yes. It brings me on to where we are with this presentation, which begins in the 1970s. But there are other places where one can begin with, as the fractionators have, back in the 50s. You, sir, have looked at some documents in the past from the 1960s, and in particular a letter from 1967, the 22nd of August 1967. The reference is DHSC 013025_062. I don't ask for that to be brought up, but that is a letter from Dr. Rosemary Briggs to Dr. Godber, the Chief Medical Officer, which raises in 1967 the question of domestic production of concentrates and suggests that 50,000 donors a year could be used to produce such concentrates in order to treat those who would most benefit from them at that time. So there is this pre-history, but this presentation is going to begin in the 1970s, where the impact of increasing commercial products and the product licenses that we have seen were issued for Hemophil and Cryopulin, the impact those have upon the spur towards domestic production and a policy that was described as self-sufficiency. I use that word somewhat cautiously because it means different things to different people at different times.
Just going back for a moment to Dr. Biggs' letter to Dr. Godber, that's a letter which, in April 1967, anticipates, does it, that there would be a need for investment to make sure that the BPL and PFC in Scotland were able to produce more. It envisages using red blood cell out of iteration of blood and harvesting the plasma. So it fits in very neatly with some of the evidence that I've been hearing over the past few weeks. And she does raise the question that if we don't get on with it, then we may have to rely upon commercial concentrates from elsewhere.
Exactly so, sir. But perhaps we can bring it up as a good place to start as any.
It might be a place to begin. It's a contribution to the debate.
It is. And Dr. Biggs is an important player in that debate, as we will see in the 1970s as well. It's DHSC 013025_062. We can see from the heading.
I was wrong about the April, it's August.
It's August, 22nd of August 1967. We can see from the heading, should anybody need the reminder, that Dr. Biggs was from the Oxford Hemophilia Centre, addressed to Dr. Godber, Chief Medical Officer. And what the letter says is this. The first paragraph is about thanking Dr. Godber for an invitation to join a committee. Paragraph 2. I should like to take this opportunity to mention the question of preparations for the treatment of haemophilia and Christmas disease. These are mainly human blood products and do not, I suppose, class as proprietary preparations. The preparations I have in mind are concentrates from human plasma of factors 8 and 9 used for the treatment of patients with haemophilia and Christmas disease, respectively. Both of these preparations are in very short supply in England, and at present they are also scarce everywhere in the world. They are so important for the treatment of these patients that their use makes the difference between life and death in many cases, and the difference between quick recovery and long-drawn, painful illness, with residual crippling in many others. At present, many haemophilic patients are not aware of the great efficacy of this treatment and do not attend as they should for treatment. In the next year or two, I would expect that these patients will attend for treatment. I have estimated, on the basis of our practice, that a minimum quantity of these concentrates required at present is the product from about 50,000 donors a year. I pause there, sir, to say that there are various measures that are used about the quantity of plasma that is required to produce concentrates. In the period here and into the early 1970s, the metric tends to be donors or donations.
Well, they didn't yet have an international standard for factor VIII activity, did they?
That's right, that's right.
When did that come in?
That comes in the mid-1970s, when firstly there is a reference to units and then it becomes international units. That refers to the end product, how much is actually made. The way that how much plasma goes in to make that end product is described in various ways, initially from donations. Later, it comes to be referred to either by weight, by kilogram, or by volume, by litre. But in this early period, it is donations. It's quite hard sometimes to translate between the different figures and must be done with a degree of caution. I'll come back to that on Thursday when we look at some statistical analyses and graphs of plasma supply and blood product production in England and Wales. But at this period, we're talking about donors, or probably more accurately, donations. 50,000 is the figure given here, and that is a figure to keep in mind as we go forward through the 1970s. Returning to the document, I quote, "When all of the patients come for treatment, more would be needed. The supply of plasma as starting material for fractionation would, I think, be no problem, since the use of the red cells can be organised. This shortage of material to treat these patients is not new, but at the meeting that I attended recently, the plans made by the United States to deal with the shortage were outlined. I have good reason to believe that within the next year or two, very large amounts of these products will become available on a commercial basis in the United States. I estimate that the product from more than 1 million donors a year will be processed. When this material comes onto the market, we shall be obliged to buy it at a very high cost for our patients unless the English shortage can be remedied." Going on to paragraph 5. In this country, we have pioneered this treatment. We have the personnel who know how to make the products. We could easily have enough plasma to serve as starting material. It would seem to me a great pity if we cannot make our own material in this country for lack of the organisation, apparatus, and buildings in which to work. The purchase of the finished products, go over to the page please, in the United States will undoubtedly be very costly. As part of the United States product will be made on contract by the American Red Cross and will presumably not be available for sale abroad, but a large amount will be made by commercial enterprises and on sale. On present prices, a course of anti-hemophilic treatment for one emergency purchased from the United States would cost $1,500 to $5,000. Surely it would be less costly to us to do everything to expedite the manufacture of these fractions in England, and in particular to accelerate as much as possible the new fractionation buildings at Elstree and in Edinburgh. I feel that it is perhaps time to try to reassess the quantities of these products that might be needed and to try and work out an emergency plan to try and meet the need." That's Dr. Biggs in August 1967. As you say, sir, some of the themes that come out of that letter include the reference to red cells, and that's the idea that one can separate red cell concentrate from the plasma, thereby allowing more plasma to be fractionated the red cells to be used in blood transfusions, more efficient use of a blood donation. There is also reference to the potential cost of the imported products and a plea, that is not to put it too high, to start thinking about what can be done in England and in Scotland to produce more products domestically, given that, as Dr. Biggs said, the relevant expertise was available in the country. The reference to Elstree and Edinburgh, Elstree is a reference to the Blood Products Laboratory, and Edinburgh to what becomes the Protein Fractionation Centre. The discussion there is of building works that were ongoing at that time.
And she refers also, but in one word, I think, to the necessary organisation to do it.
Yes.
Which we've heard, again, perhaps a lot about just recently.
Yes, and that will be something that comes up again repeatedly in the 70s. Of notice, the fact that the letter is addressed to Dr. Godler at
Yes.
the Department of Health, or as it was then called, the Ministry of Health, later becomes the Department of Health and Social Security. I will be coming on to the 70s shortly, but just so there is a route map of where we're going to go, the intention of the presentation is to trace the rise in demand for factor VIII concentrates in England and Wales and the associated calls for national self-sufficiency, which pick up on what Dr. Biggs said in that earlier letter, and indeed are amplified by Dr. Biggs herself. We will look then at how that fed into estimates for future usage and planning on how to increase both plasma supply and the production of blood products. We will consider the response of the DHSS and the regional health authorities. Then a discussion of the announcements in late 1974 and early 1975, about which you have heard some evidence from Dr. Owen and others, the £500,000 of central DHSS funding to increase plasma supply for fractionation. We will look at how that money was spent, what was said about it, and what was achieved. We will then turn to increases in demand for factor concentrate in the second half of the 1970s, and the revised estimates that follow. We will look at the related need to redevelop BPL at that time, both to increase capacity and in response to the Medicines Inspectorate report. This led to what was called originally the Stop-Gap Programme, which, as the name suggests, was an interim measure for some redevelopment before a full redevelopment of BPL. That programme was later changed to be called the MARP-01 programme, MARP standing for Medicines Act Rehabilitation Programme. And again, as the name suggests, you can see how Stopgap has been knocked off course by the Medicines Inspectorate report, although there is a great deal of overlap between those two programmes. At that stage, sir, the presentation comes to the point where Dr. Walford's evidence to you began, which is the discussion about the full redevelopment of BPL. To lapse into an analogy, the camera at that point is going to pan out, both in the written presentation and in the oral presentation, to give an overview of the events that led to the redevelopment of BPL. But there is no intention to try to repeat the detailed evidence that was given by Dr. Walford and by reference to the documents about that period. There's similarly going to be an overview of the introduction of heat treatment at BPL and at its sister plant, the Plasma Fractionation Laboratory, PFL, in Oxford. More detail is going to be provided on those matters when Ms. Richards takes you through the presentations on Dr. Richard Lane and Dr. Jim Smith. So I will touch very lightly, if at all, orally on those. But there is an overview in the written presentation, which may assist to provide some background, some context for what is to follow. Having gone through the events chronologically, the intention is then to zoom in again with the camera on a couple of thematic points, looking at the data that the inquiry has identified on 3 issues. And the plan is to do this looking across the 1970s and the 80s, so that we can see the patterns developing without the chronology getting in the way. The first is about the estimates that were made for factor 8 usage during the 70s and the 80s. The second issue is the level of plasma supply to BPL and to PFL. And the third issue is the amount of factor 8 concentrates that BPL and PFL could have produced and did produce during that time. By looking thematically at those matters, it is hoped that this will help to identify the shortcomings that meant that clinicians in England and Wales continued to use imported concentrates throughout this period. The written presentation will be published on the inquiry's website. I'm not quite sure if it is up there yet, but it will be soon if not. It is also available on relativity. I understand that at the moment it is only available to the legal representatives of the core participants, but it will be made more generally available on relativity. It is accompanied by 7 appendices that will be published and disclosed in the same way, and they provide more detail on specific points. For example, the detail of how the £500,000 was spent on a region-by-region basis, and the documentary evidence about the role of the SAG-M additive in the plasma supply. Now, I won't seek to summarise all of those appendices. They're intended to assist on more technical and more granular details that are important, and I would invite everybody who is interested to read those, but for reasons of time, we will not be going through those in enormous detail. The exceptions are Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, which will form the mainstay of that thematic presentation that I've just discussed. The focus of this presentation is on factor 8, the product that was more widely used in England and Wales and posed more problems for government and fractionators in terms of providing enough of it. England and Wales was largely self-sufficient in factor 9 for much of this period, but there were imports, particularly following the introduction of heat treatment. That is something that we will touch upon, but the focus will be on factor 8. There will also be a presentation next week on the specific question of the pool sizes that were used in BPL and in PFC, and indeed in Oxford as well. As you know, sir, it will be myself, Ms. Richards, and Mr. Buchra who are giving these presentations, but we have been assisted enormously by the hard work of the inquiry legal team in preparing them. Their names have been added to the appendices and to the main presentation as well. We are extremely grateful for everything that they have done. Before diving into the 1970s, it may be helpful just to explore briefly a few themes that emerge in this period on this topic. The first theme is really to identify the 3 elements that determined how much domestic factor 8 concentrate could be produced. Those 3 elements were the plasma supply, the ability of BPL and PFC to fractionate that plasma, and the planning assumptions that went into both plasma supply and fractionation capacity. And those assumptions were based on estimates of demand for the products. Those are the 3 elements that we will look at repeatedly. The second theme, and something that you, sir, have already touched upon, is the lack of a central body with executive powers to direct and coordinate those with a responsibility for those three different elements. Plasma supply fell within the remit of the regional transfusion centres and the regional health authorities that funded those regional transfusion centres. Fractionation fell within the remit of the Blood Products Laboratory and Protein Fractionation Centre. The DHSS funded both of those elements, but it did so indirectly, in general, with one exception that we will come to look at. The clinicians were working within the NHS, and again, the funding came ultimately from the DHSS, but there was a strong value placed on clinical freedom and clinical independence. Ministers and civil servants had little power or inclination to dictate policies to doctors, transfusion directors, and fractionators, and they equally may not have taken kindly to attempts to do so. These different groups were both interdependent and independent. The third theme, and associated with that lack of a central executive body, was the lack of a single accepted definition of what self-sufficiency meant. This is a matter on which you have heard evidence before. Did it include prophylactic treatment? Behind that question lay the wider issue of the type of life that those with haemophilia should aspire to lead. We will hear some of the debate that took place on that point. That is covered in particular in Appendix 2. Throughout that theme, there is an underlying question of whether or not an assessment should be made of clinical need rather than clinical demand. Clinical demand reflected what patients and clinicians would like. Clinical need reflected what those more centrally thought should be supplied.
Yes, at some stage we may have to think about. I don't necessarily suggest in this week how both of those demand and need reflect what the patient wanted. Exactly.
And that is not something that we will be looking at in detail this week, because the focus is rather at the other end of the telescope about how fractionators and civil servants and regional administrators responded to what they understood the demand to be. It's not a question of where that, how that demand was formed in terms of how much information patients had and what their views were compared to the views of the clinicians. That is not something that I seek to discuss in the next couple of days. It is a very important point, and it's not one that I know, sir, but it's not one that you will overlook, but it is not the focus of this presentation.
No, it's just that it's can be difficult to talk about clinical need across a group when what one person needs may be something for that person to have an input into, as opposed to something which is determined by the body looking at what they need in their opinion. And that was what I had in mind.
Yes, absolutely. It's the top-down, bottom-up approach.
How those two, personal autonomy and clinical decision-making, or for that matter, strategic decision-making, fit together.
Yes. The fourth theme that we've identified is the importance of the availability of commercial products in pushing forward both demands for self-sufficiency and pressures on clinicians, on politicians and civil servants, and on fractionators. Those commercial products threatened, at least in some eyes, the very nature and the very existence of the UK's voluntary donor system. As we will see, in the early stages of the development of a policy on self-sufficiency, the drive comes from cost and the need to try to produce a domestic product that wasn't as expensive as the commercial imports, and to provide enough of it to ensure that the commercial imports didn't dominate the UK market. Later, principles about safety and altruism also develop within the argument. The protection of the voluntary donor system is something that weighed very heavily, in particular on Dr. Owen. Finally, sir, a theme which runs throughout the earlier period is the financial pressure on all involved, particularly in the 1970s, the start of the 1980s. There's a common theme across those different bodies, for clinicians, for fractionators, for civil servants, for regional health authorities in that period, in the 1970s. No attempt is made here to try to describe the difficult economic environment in which these decisions were taking place, but that is, of course, a factor which weighed very heavily upon all of those involved. With that introduction, sir, and mindful as well of the letter that we've looked at from Dr. Biggs, we're going to turn to the early 1970s and the impact of commercial blood products. If we could bring up, please, Paul, OXUH 40673. This is a letter dated the 18th of July 1972. And if we could turn, please, to the second page, Paul, just at the bottom, we can see who it's from and to. From Dr. Rizza of the Oxford Hemophilia Centre, and it's sent to W. Trillwood, who is the Director of Pharmaceutical Services. The relevance of his role there will become obvious as we read through. And we can see that it is copied to Dr. Biggs, Dr. Bidwell, who worked at the Protein Fractionation Laboratory in Oxford, and Dr. Maycock, who was the Director of BPL and the Consultant Advisor on Blood Transfusions to the DHSS at that time. What Dr. Rizza says in the letter is this. Dear Mr. Trillwood, during the past 12 months, we have been experiencing increasing difficulties in meeting the needs for AHG for our haemophilic patients. I pause there, sir, to say that that is a reference to anti-haemophilic globulin. It is used often interchangeably in this period with the word concentrate. I have used the word concentrate more consistently in the report, just so that it's clear what we are talking about. But here he is referring to factor VIII concentrates. At present, we rely entirely upon human cryoprecipitate supplied by Dr. Grant of the Regional Blood Transfusion Centre and freeze-dried human AHG concentrate supplied by Dr. Bidwell of the Plasma Fractionation Laboratory, supplemented by a small amount of human AHG from the Lister Institute of Preventative Medicine, Elstree. Of course, that's what becomes BPL. During 1971, we received and used concentrates of human blood clotting factors derived from more than 20,000 blood donors. This material was mainly from donors in the Oxford region, and we are deeply indebted to the Regional Blood Transfusion Service for the cooperation over the years, which has made it possible for them to channel plasma from nearly a quarter of the total donations of the region into fractionation process. Despite this seemingly excellent supply, we are chronically short of material to treat the ever-increasing number of patients that come to Oxford. This shortage is not new, and we have always had to give priority for treatment to emergency cases and to the treatment of children to prevent crippling deformity. The restriction has meant that the surgical waiting list for patients requiring non-urgent operations has grown, and at present, 25 patients are on that list. About half of the patients treated in Oxford during 1971 were from the Oxford region, and half were from other parts of the United Kingdom. go on to the next part of the letter. Thank you. Until recently, this shortage of therapeutic material was unavoidable, since no suitable commercial material derived from human blood was available. There are now two sources of supply. One is from the Highland Laboratories, and the other is from Immuno AG of Vienna. Pause there to note that's a reference to hemophil and cryobilin. Both are expensive, and it would require material to the value of £2,000 to treat one operation case. Both of these preparations are clinically effective and have been used extensively in other countries. The immuno concentrate has the advantage of being derived from blood which has been tested and found to be free of hepatitis-associated antigen, thus diminishing the risk of hepatitis. At present, we are often forced to balance the needs of one patient against those of another in allocating treatment. This potentially dangerous practice was reasonable when there was no alternative supply of therapeutic material. We feel now that good material is available commercially. We feel that now that good material is available commercially, our supply should be supplemented by the use of this commercially available concentrate. It seems to us quite unethical to continue to withhold treatment from patients when material exists to supply their needs. We therefore ask that the Immuno AG Factor VIII concentrate be bought at an estimated cost of about £15,000 per annum for use of the Oxford Hemophilia Centre. About half of the patients for whom this material would be used would come from other regions. Most of the material would go to cover patients requiring major surgery. This additional supply would much increase the safety margin for the treatment of urgent cases and would permit us over the years to lessen the waiting list for non-urgent operations. That is Dr. Rizza, the 18th of July, 1972. A couple of things to pick up from that. First is that many of the predictions that Dr. Biggs had made in 1967 were now coming to reality, albeit perhaps a few years later than she had anticipated in her earlier letter. It's notable that Dr. Rizza's request for funds was based on a medical assessment of clinical needs and was framed by reference to medical ethics. It is also notable that it's the recent availability of commercial concentrates which have prompted his concerns in that regard. We also highlight the fact that Dr. Rizza expressly acknowledges the expense of those concentrates. And finally, we note that the request that Dr. Rizza is making is about obtaining material to facilitate surgery. No reference is made at that time, in 1972, to either home treatment or wider prophylactic treatment. As is set out in the written presentation, Dr. Rizza's concerns were shared by others, and I refer to paragraph 9 of the written presentation. I won't go to all of the documents that were in it. We can see there that in October 1972, there was a meeting that took place of Hemophilia Centre directors. And following that meeting, the chair, Professor Edward Blackburn of the Sheffield Centre, wrote to Sir George Godber, the Chief Medical Officer, and requested that the DHSS establish an expert committee. That committee, he said, should consider the supply of therapeutic materials in relation to the treatment of haemophilia and allied disorders. In the letter and at the meeting, Professor Blackburn expressed that his colleagues had referred to a preference for concentrates over cryoprecipitate, which is something we will pick up in some further documents. And he also mentioned the desirability of home treatment. in his letter, and I won't take you to it, but I will just quote the concluding section. He said, and I quote, "The directors feel that there is an urgent need to increase supplies of factor VIII concentrate, in particular those of freeze-dried concentrate. Many feel that if a British preparation cannot be made available very shortly, the commercial preparations should be bought." An interesting distinction there, perhaps, sir, that the first sentence, the need to increase domestic supply, appears to enjoy the unanimous support of the directors. The second sentence about buying commercial products in the interim is expressed by reference to many feeling that way, so not unanimity on that point. Professor Blackburn's letter was copied to Dr. William Maycock, as I've said was the consultant advisor and also the director of BPL. He expressed concern over the cost of commercial concentrates and supported the proposal of a working group being set up to look at this matter. In a memorandum dated the 7th of February 1973, which is referred to at paragraph 14 of a written presentation, Dr. Maycock said that, in his view, and I quote, "as far as possible, the UK should aim to be self-sufficient in the supply of preparations of anti-hemophilic globulin and factor IX." And he goes on to say that the preparations made in the UK can be as good as any commercial preparation and are available more cheaply. He also adds that there is insufficient supply at the moment and pressure from those who are using the products because of the commercial material that is being made available to them. The interventions of Professor Blackburn and Dr. Maycock led to the DHSS establishing an expert group. We can see that thought is being given to this at the most senior levels within the department, because in an internal minute dated the 20th of February 1973, which is at paragraph 15 of the written presentation, Sir Philip Rogers, who was the permanent secretary and so the most senior civil servant of the department, was said to be, and I quote, "concerned about the possible financial consequences and is anxious that these should be quantified as soon as possible, bearing in mind the scope for meeting blood product requirements from home sources." So he is expressing concern about the cost of commercial imports and the question of what can be done domestically to meet the supply demands. On the 6th of March 1973, Dr. Godber, the CMO, sent a circular to all senior administrative medical officers and copied it to haemophilia centres and other regional health administrators and informed them that the expert group would be formed. That circular is referred to at paragraph 16 of the written presentation. We can see from it that concerns about cost are again at the forefront of Dr. Godber's mind. There is reference to the commercial products which are being provided. And Dr. Godber says, it has come, and I quote, "it has come to the notice of the department that one of the firms is already engaged in active promotion of this expensive product. The firm has indicated that they can supply a large quantity of human AHG concentrate, and this could result in very significant expenditure if amounts were bought in excess of immediate needs." And I stress those last words, sir, because that is again hinting at this debate about what these concentrates should be used for. Immediate needs may suggest what is often referred to as on-demand treatment, a response to a bleed, and possibly also emergency surgery. There is, in this document, the circular that was sent by Dr. Godber, no reference to safety concerns about imported commercial concentrates. The expert group on the treatment of haemophilia is the body that was set up to examine these questions at the prompting of Dr. Maycock and Professor Blackburn. And it met for the first time on the 20th of March 1973. And at that meeting, it considered a paper that was presented by Dr. Biggs. We will look at that paper first before we then look at the discussion that followed. And if we could go, please, Paul, to PRSE 302-553. You can see, although the paper is marked draft, we think that this is the version that was seen. It is entitled Factor 8 Concentrates in the Treatment of Hemophilia. And we can see on the title page that it is Dr. Biggs who has written it. We could go on to the next page, please. I'm not going to read all of the way through this document. I will point out how the document was structured and some of the calculations within it before turning to the conclusions, and also highlight one or two passages as we go through. What Dr. Biggs is setting out to do is trying to discuss the pros and cons of cryoprecipitate and factor concentrate, and to work out the needs of patients with haemophilia in the UK. And she begins, as we can see halfway down the first page of the report, by discussing the number of patients with haemophilia per 100,000 of population. And if we could turn to the second page, please, Paul. The figures that she adopts, or the range that Dr. Biggs adopts, is between 1,754 and 3,000 patients. And we can see that that is expressed to be for Great Britain. I read that as meaning Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but that's my interpretation, not something which is expressed on the document. Dr. Biggs stresses that that is an estimate and it is not based on exact data. There was no central database at that time. On the figure for 1,754, she says that this is the number of patients known to have attended haemophilia centres. But she says that we know that there are more than that number of patients because cryoprecipitate is also sent elsewhere and has been used in other hospitals as well. So she says the lower limit for the number is 1,754, likely to be more. The upper limit is not known for certain. If we look at the next section, the Factor 8 preparations at present used to treat haemophilic patients, I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from this because it's...
That would be severely affected patients, would it?
This is an attempt to calculate the total number of patients. We will see later in the document that there is an estimate of the number of most severely affected.
Well, the reason I say that is if we look at the top of the page, she starts off talking about the United States estimates, and she says the estimate for the severely affected patients in the USA indicates about 12,000 patients in a population of 200 million. For Great Britain, the total would be between 1,754 to 3,000. So that looks as though that's for severely affected. Presumably, people who were severe haemophiliacs is what she means by that, but that again is an assumption, which may be wrong.
I think so. So, but a problem with many of these documents is that it's not entirely clear what it is, but what the numbers represent, and whether or not this is intended just to be people with severe haemophilia or others as well. As we'll see in the debate that follows, there is a number that is given, and I'm tempted though I am to try to pluck it out of my memory. I will undoubtedly get it wrong if I do. So I will resist the temptation, but we will see that number given later for the amount of people that are considered to be or who would benefit most from the concentrates being provided at home. And that figure may correlate more closely to those with severe haemophilia. But certainly the data on which she draws is a US study about people with severe haemophilia, and then she extrapolates that over to the UK. And in fairness to Dr. Biggs, she emphasises repeatedly, this is not exact. Turning then to the factor 8 preparations at present used to treat haemophilic patients. This is helpful just to gain an understanding of the base level, where they were at that time, before considering what they plan to do about it. If I read from that, Dr. Biggs said this, and I quote, "At present, the treatment of bleeding in a haemophilic patient consists in giving a calculated dose of an anti-haemophilic factor 8 preparation, as soon as any symptoms of spontaneous bleeding arise, and of giving enough material during and following operations to maintain normal hemostasis. Each of the haemophilic patients treated at Hemophilia centres during 1971 had on average received material from 122 donor units. This figure refers to the total amount of material that the patient received. It does not refer to the number of donors to whose blood patients have been exposed through the use of pools of plasma. Most of this treatment was for on-demand treatment, which is given whenever the patient feels that a hemorrhage is occurring, and for major surgery and dental extraction. At many haemophilia centres, the directors feel that they could use at least twice as much material as they receive, and that the present shortage of materials leads to a dangerous selection between more or less urgent cases for treatment and the accumulation of patients on long waiting lists for non-urgent operations." That last comment, sir, is one that echoes the letter from Dr. Rizzo that we looked at earlier. If we could turn to the next page, please, Paul, electronic page 5, we can see that Dr. Biggs then goes into a comparison of concentrates and cryoprecipitate, and in particular compares 4 different aspects. The first is the yield of factor 8 activity. Here it is, the word yield is being used as a measure of the efficiency of both concentrates and cryoprecipitate in using a blood donation and providing the necessary treatment to the patient. Elsewhere, yield is used in a more technical sense. The second criteria is the convenience of a material in preparation and in use. The third criteria is the reliability of the material from batch to batch. The fourth criteria is the complications which might attend treatment with the various preparations. I summarise Dr. Biggs's findings at paragraph 23 of the written presentation. I won't take you all of the way through the document. If I summarise briefly, on yield, Dr. Biggs's ultimate conclusion is that the 2 products are equally efficient. On convenience of manufacture, cryoprecipitate was stated to be easy to manufacture in small doses, but, and I quote, on a large scale and widely distributed over centres with very different facilities, the method is less satisfactory. Concentrates, by contrast, required a higher capital expenditure, but were, in her assessment, probably less expensive in the long run. On convenience of use, Dr. Biggs referred to the need to thaw cryoprecipitate. The fact that the process of making up cryoprecipitate was, in her words, open to many abuses. She stressed the variety in the activities of individual doses in cryo and the need for a deep freeze. She contrasted that with concentrates, which she said were, and I quote, very convenient to use. On reliability from batch to batch, Dr. Biggs referred to data from a study that had been conducted and found that cryoprecipitate was very variable. Concentrates, in contrast, could be assayed to give a reliable estimate of dose activity per dose. On the final criteria for complications, I will take you to the document. I'll take you in particular to electronic page 10. This is a section which I think has been put in evidence before, but it's helpful to see it in the context in which it was written and the context of the debate which is to follow. The heading is Complications of Treatment, and what Dr. Biggs wrote is this. About 1 in 800 donors is a carrier of hepatitis B antigen. The larger the number of donors concerned in the preparation of concentrate, the greater the risk of exposing the recipient to material containing hepatitis B antigen. The use of freeze-dried concentrate, which is made of pools of 200 donors, or even higher numbers for commercial material, must carry a higher risk than single donations. But there is the possibility that the development of jaundice may be dose-related, and that single infected bottles may be more dangerous to the individual patient than pooled material in which the virus is diluted. Despite this, the frequency of hepatitis in severely affected patients does not seem to increase significantly with increased use of freeze-dried concentrates. This is shown by a low incidence of jaundice in patients treated in Oxford, who have half of the material given to them as freeze-dried concentrate, and in those treated at other British centres. The conclusion is also supported by data collected in the United States. A reference is made to an article letter by Casper and Kipnis from 1972. The reference to that is in the written presentation. An exception to this rule concerns the mildly affected patients to whom very little treatment is given. These patients do seem to have a higher incidence of hepatitis if large pool fractions are used. Casper and Kipnis, 1972, showed this, as did also the British survey, where female carriers of haemophilia treated with concentrate had a high incidence of hepatitis. Since the majority of patients are in the multi-transfused category, the increased risk of exposure to hepatitis would not seem to be an important disadvantage to the use of concentrates from pooled material. Hepatitis is, in any case, a complication which should decrease with universal screening of donors for hepatitis antigen. The incidence of factor VIII antibodies does not seem to be related to the type of material used, and a reference is made there to the British survey. So this is a document which dates from 1973, and so the discussion of hepatitis there is of hepatitis B rather than non-A, non-B hepatitis.
And the comment about the incidence of factor VIII, that complication should decrease. I think universal screening of donors for hepatitis-associated antigen, hepatitis B antigen, had been introduced in 1972.
I think that's right, sir. The test gradually improves in its sensitivity over the years as well.
So what she's reporting on is material which was, some of which probably was collected and manufactured into product, so far as it was concentrate, before it was screened.
Yes. Going back to the paper, we can see that the next issue that Dr. Biggs turns to is the amount of factor VIII concentrate required to treat haemophiliacs in Great Britain. We can see from the paragraph that follows that she bases many of her calculations on work that was done at Trelour's, in which observations were done of the students there about the number of bleeds they had per year, and then From that, Dr. Biggs makes a number of assumptions, necessary assumptions in order to do the calculations, but assumptions nonetheless, about the number of bleeds per year, the amount of material that is required per bleed, the average patient weight. If we go over to the next page, please. I won't take you through all of the calculations. We can see there is also reference in the second paragraph to the amount of plasma that can be taken from each donation. And the figure there is 200 to 220 millilitres of plasma. And we'll see in later papers, reference in England and Wales at least, is made to 180 millilitres. So this may be optimistic as to how much plasma can be obtained per donation. Dr. Biggs goes through these various assumptions and calculations to try to provide a figure for how much factor VIII will be required per year. It's important to note that she is talking here about on-demand treatment. And then in the next section, if we go over to page 13, she then adds in major surgery. And then in the next section, page 14, dental extractions. So these are the calculations that are being done. And when she puts all of this together, at page 15, we can see at the top of the page, the ultimate conclusion that Dr. Biggs makes is this. Thus, for all types of bleeding, spontaneous, at operation and dentistry and after, the total material required is likely to lie between 400,000 and 750,000 donor units per annum. I pause there, sir, and contrast that with the 1967 figure of 50,000. Dr. Biggs' assessment now is that it's between 400,000 and 750,000. And this estimate includes on-demand treatment.
Just one question. She's talking here, is she, about the UK as a whole, or the England and Wales as a whole?
She refers to Great Britain.
Great Britain, so that's the UK.
I think that may be a misnonym for Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
When she spoke about the 50,000 earlier, she spoke about it on the basis of our practice, and her own reference in the, I think, the earlier letter of 67 was 20,000 donor units. So this may not be comparing like with like.
No, I was about to say it is not a direct comparison. She does refer to our practice.
Which may mean Oxford, and Oxford was recognised as a centre, wasn't it?
It does, and from the context of her letter, she refers not just to Oxford, but to patients who are coming into Oxford.
Yes.
So it is a significant proportion of England, but it is not the same figure here, which is the between 400,000 and 750,000. And of course, Dr. Biggs, in her 1967 letter, wasn't seeking to project into the future the demand that would be required in 6 or 7 years' time. She was talking about what, in her practice, at that time was needed then. That was for 50,000. The figure here now is between 400,000 and 750,000 donor units. Yeah. Now that, as she stresses, is for on-demand treatment. So bleeds, major surgery, dental extraction. A little further down the page, she goes on to talk about prophylactic treatment. And I read from that section now. Prophylactic treatment to haemophilic patients would require much more material, since this treatment envisages regular administration of factor VIII once or twice a week to the patient, regardless of whether or not bleeding has occurred. The estimate of the amount required for such treatment in the USA is 13 million donor units, reference to Stengel in 1972. So for Great Britain, an estimate would be about 3 million donor units. Lazarson, 1972, estimates 636 donor units per patient for prophylaxis, which would give a maximum figure for Great Britain of about 2 million donor units. It is not at present certain that this prophylaxis is desirable for even the most severely affected patients. It is certainly at present impracticable. In the USA, about 4% of patients receive prophylaxis. Home treatment. Home treatment should be distinguished from prophylaxis. Home treatment involves the administration of therapeutic material in the home by a relative, by the patient to himself, or by the general practitioner. This form of treatment is becoming accepted and should not involve the use of more material than good hospital care. In fact, the experience of Lazarson, 1972, suggests that more material is not used for home care. There is no doubt that the freeze-dried concentrate is the best material to use for home care. Were the most severely affected 1,000 patients allocated to home treatment, this would require about 250,000 donor units of freeze-dried concentrate. But this would be instead of, not in addition to, the doses given on demand in hospital. I will come back to those figures in a second, sir. I note that 1,000 patients who are most severely affected was the figure that I was trying to recall earlier. I would have got it right. I should have guessed.
But it's maybe no more than a calculating figure, because were the most severely affected 1,000 patients, it isn't saying of the patients 1,000 are most severely affected. It's calculating how much would be needed for the worst cases.
Yes. So it's not saying that is the total number of people with severe haemophilia in the country.
Yes.
I just mentioned in parenthesis here, sir, that the assumption that is made there about home treatment and that it shouldn't involve the use of more concentrate than in hospital is an important assumption which plays out in the estimates that follow. It is one that is later challenged, and that there is a suggestion that more concentrate is used, particularly in the early stages of home treatment, than would be used in hospital.
Well, I think we saw some evidence of that when we were looking at the haemophilia centres and the use of concentrate, that home treatment was thought to add something, this is a very broad recollection and may be wrong, but it's something in the region of a third on top to the amount that might be needed compared to on demand.
There is a debate which emerges about this. There is a sense that the higher use of home treatment initially is making up for previous under-treatment, which was done in hospital. And the reference to good hospital care by Dr. Biggs may be hinting at that. There is also a subsequent debate, which is not quantified in the papers that I have seen, that the earlier treatment of bleeds at home leads ultimately to less concentrate being used than would be used in hospital because the bleed does not become as severe.
Well, that certainly was the suggestion early on and used to justify, in part, home treatment, quite apart from the much greater convenience for the individual, it might be thought. But I think the objective evidence so far seen, as far as I remember it, is that it added to the consumption.
That would certainly fit with what we see in terms of the demand curve once home treatment becomes more widely used.
Indeed, it was, I think, one of the suggestions made at the time that people became aware of the risk that blood products might transmit whatever it was that was causing AIDS, that a suggestion was to reduce the amount of people on home treatment or reduce home treatment, and thereby lessen the need for factor concentrate and thereby lessen the need for reliance upon imported factor concentrate.
I think so. We will see in some of the later papers that there is an acceptance that the assumption made here by Dr. Biggs is not one which is borne out in practice. Dr. Biggs goes on in the paper to discuss the economics of treatment. There's a short section in which she points out that the cost of treating patients with haemophilia is high, but she doesn't try to compute the figures. But she does make the point at the end of that paragraph that proper treatment is probably no more expensive than that of renal patients requiring dialysis. Then we come to the conclusions of Dr. Biggs's paper, page 17. I will read through these and then I will come back to some of the numbers that are contained within them. Conclusion 1. Calculations suggest that the amount of material required for optimum treatment of all the haemophilia patients in Great Britain would be derived from 400,000 to 700,000 blood donations a year. The present supply is of the order of 300,000 per year, of which most is in the form of cryoprecipitate. 2. Comparisons of cryoprecipitate and freeze-dried concentrate made in Oxford suggest that from the point of view of conservation of the factor VIII activity of the donor plasma and of recovery of infused activity in the patient, the two preparations are equally efficient. 3. The cryoprecipitate is more difficult to make up for administration, and much factor VIII activity may be lost when inexperienced staff handle the material prior to giving the infusion. Moreover, the material varies in activity from one centre to another. There is evidence that the Oxford material may be among the best. 4. The pool size used in the preparation of concentrate does not affect the incidence of factor VIII antibodies, nor of clinical jaundice in multi-transfused patients. 5. For home treatment, it is our opinion that only the freeze-dried concentrate is useful in most cases. The gradual introduction of the most severely affected patients who have the most frequent bleeding to home treatment would reduce hospital management of haemophilia by about half. To give this proportion of patients home treatment would involve the use of concentrate from about 250,000 donors a year. The present total supply is of the order of 25,000 a year. 6. We think that a target should be set to provide factor VIII concentrate from 250,000 donations by 1975, and that over 10 years an attempt should be made to provide all the necessary material in this form. By 1975, the magnitude of the problem should be more exactly defined by surveys being made by the Haemophilia Centre directors. 7. It may be noted that freeze-dried material of good quality is now available commercially. At present, patient treatment at many of the haemophilia centres in this country involves a dangerous policy of balancing the needs of one patient against another and of denying patients reconstructive orthopaedic surgery, which would greatly improve their lives. We feel it very important that the material made in the United Kingdom, which is second to none in quality, should be substantially increased in amount. Otherwise, we feel that material should be bought from commercial sources which now provide material of good quality both from the point of view of factor VIII activity and from the point of view of screening the donors for hepatitis-associated antigen. And if we could just turn, please, Paul, to page 21. Dr. Biggs referred to Table 2. That is a table which is appended to her report, and we can see there that it is a representation of therapeutic materials for the treatment of haemophilia. We can see the 4 different types of material in the first column: whole blood, plasma, cryoprecipitate, and freeze-dried concentrate. And then the assessments that Dr. Biggs made of factor VIII activities and the post-infusion level of plasma factor VIII as a percentage of normal. We can see that, although I didn't take you to the sections on whole blood and plasma, Dr. Biggs's conclusion is, in essence, that they're not much use for treating haemophilia. And then we can see in the final column the approximate donor units at present made. We can see that at that time, about 25,000 units were dedicated to concentrate, 220,000 to cryoprecipitate, and 44,000 to plasma. Just before the break, sir, I will go back to some of those figures that are given in the report, just so that we have in mind what they represent. I'm afraid that this gets complicated and will become more complicated as different estimates develop. But the first figure is that figure of 400,000 and 750,000. So that is the range of donor units per annum that Dr. Biggs calculates is required for on-demand treatment. Now, expressed in its raw form, that could be treatment either of cryoprecipitate or of factor VIII concentrate. And as they're equally efficient, the question is simply how you divide those two. So you could have 200,000 cryo, 200,000 concentrate, and that would be your 400,000. Later, in the conclusions section, Dr. Biggs refers to 400,000 to 700,000 donations per annum being required for optimum treatment. So 700,000 rather than 750,000. I'm not quite sure why that distinction is there. She says that the figure at the time is 300,000 donor units, so below even what she considers to be the minimum.
For optimum treatment?
Well, the optimum treatment is 700,000
yes.
or 750,000. The requirement for on-demand treatment, as she puts it, is 400,000. So in her analysis, there is at that time under-treatment, and that's consistent with what she has said in her letters and what Dr. Rizzo has said in his. As mentioned earlier, that figure should be the same whether that treatment is given in hospital or on home treatment in Dr. Biggs' analysis. We've discussed that. Prophylactic treatment on Dr. Biggs' analysis is going to require much more material, and she put a range of estimates between 2 million and 3 million donor units per annum based upon the American experience.
And she says it's impracticable.
Impracticable, and at that time it wasn't necessarily clinically advised either. And we will see, I'm not going to go through the debate on prophylactic treatment in the 1970s, but every now and again it crops up in the papers, and we can see that it is something which is being considered at this early stage, but it is not inevitable in the mind of Dr. Biggs and indeed others at this time that prophylactic treatment is going to come in, but they are aware that it is a possibility. The final set of figures, or the final figure to refer to, is this figure of 250,000 donor units, a figure which is going to be important in the debate that follows. And that figure, 250,000, is, as you said, sir, for the 1,000 patients who are most severely affected and would most benefit from home treatment. So Dr. Biggs is plainly not saying 250,000 donor units per year will provide self-sufficiency. The figure for on-demand self-sufficiency, as we've seen, is between 400,000 and 750,000 units at that time, or expressed as 400,000 to 700,000 for optimum treatment. We will also see from the conclusions that there is a sense that there should be a push, firstly, to produce those 250,000 units of concentrate by 1975. And that would be a tenfold increase from the 25,000 units then dedicated to factor concentrates. And that over a longer period, given as 10 years, an attempt should be made to provide all the necessary material in the form of concentrates. So that is all between 400,000 and 700 or 750,000 units. I pause there just to note that although it is expressed in that way, I'm not sure that should be read literally as meaning that there should be no cryoprecipitate produced anywhere. Earlier in the report, Dr. Biggs had referred to the preference at that time for single donor units to be given to people with mild haemophilia based on the evidence that you then had. So this paper isn't necessarily making an assessment about how treatment should be done 10 years down the line. So I just add that as a slight caveat into perhaps reading too much into that word. But certainly the thrust of the paper is that more should be dedicated to concentrate at the expense of plasma, which was dedicated to cryo. So I note the time. I wonder if that's a good place to stop for our break.
Yes, well, let's take a break until 10 to 12 then, shall we? 10 to 12.